The best-selling author and syndicated columnist and a great friend of the program, Ann Coulter, joins me now. The author most recently of In Trump We Trust, E Pluribus Awesome, although I'd rather have you go back and read her books about illegal aliens because you'd learn a lot about the current situation we find ourselves in. Ann, how are you tonight?
Fine, thanks. How are you, Lars?
I'm doing very well. Bang-up column where you start with John Kelly trying to, well, I guess be as charitable as he possibly can by saying, well, an awful lot of the people who come in illegally are rural, poor, unskilled, illiterate, don't speak English, major deficits, and the media goes nuts.
Yes, I was thinking the way he said it was lovely. I won't criticize him for it, but it was sort of, the way one often thinks. That's a really good point Trump is making. I wish he would have said it this other way. Well, Kelly did it that way. It was perfectly lovely, utterly unobjectionable. He said, look, most of the illegals crossing our border, they're not bad people, but they're just not going to fit in with modern society. They're overwhelmingly very rural people with no education. They can't read. They can't speak English. We have a modern technological society. Within an hour, I would object to that they're not bad people. I mean, they are thieves. They're stealing jobs and government benefits, educations, housing, food stamps that are meant for our own people, even the best of them. But within an hour, I'm listening to MSNBC, and they're all calling him a racist. So I thought, what was the point? What was the point of that? And, of course, all of the usual cliches. We're a nation of immigrants, and whenever anyone in the media gets wind of someone with any Irish in them, any touch of the blarney, it's suddenly, well, your relatives, that's what they used to say about your relatives. I have a good portion of Irish in me, where I got my taste for alcohol. And for one thing, some of them go back to fighting in the Revolutionary War. It's not like there weren't any Irish people. I mean, some of my ancestors. It's not like there weren't any Irish people here at the time of the founding of the country. But it's strange that, yeah, there may be a disproportionate number of the descendants of immigrants on TV, but somebody's got to tell them. American history didn't start in 1850. We had a going country then. It was the greatest country in the world back before we ever experienced our first wave of immigration, starting around 1850. You had Jamestown, the shining city on the hill, the Revolutionary War. We had won a war with Great Britain. We were on the verge of being the first country in the world to fight a war to end slavery. We had invented, steamships, electricity. We had invented a democratic republic. It was the greatest country in the world back then. People came to what was already a going society, one that had been created out of the mud by the people who arrived here around 1600. And going forward 100 years. And in point of fact, the wave of Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants and Jewish immigrants were a big heap of trouble. I don't know why most of the Irish immigrants absolutely 100% spoke English. That's just a lie you've been hearing. But wow, were they criminal. I write about it a little bit in my book.
Adios.
No, it is in Demonic, about mobs and how this country has dealt with mobs. The Irish mob during the draft riots in 1863 in New York, there's a book about it. Just stunning, shocking, disgusting violence. They were very poor. It took, according to Michael Barone, about 120 years for the Hibernians to fully assimilate. But as I point out in the column, well, two things. One was, many things, but one big point is it's not like this was how the Irish always lived. They came here because of a one-time calamity, the Irish potato famine. They weren't bringing an utterly corrupt culture with them. Again, well more than half spoke English. But number two, there weren't a bunch of ethnic activist groups. There wasn't a La Raza for the Irish. There wasn't, the New York Times and all of these morons on TV screaming anytime anyone noticed the Irish's bad behavior. They were knocked around by no-nonsense priests, sent to school. It was the priests whipping these kids into order, making them learn to read and write, and forcing them to go home to their wives and own no illegitimate kids. No, now the Catholic Church is, in many parts of the country, not across the board, but in many parts of the country, they've just transformed themselves into this, La Raza immigrants' rights group. Well, the idea, what a church is supposed to be doing is knocking its own bums into shape. That's what the Catholic Church did with the Irish, and that's why by the 1950s, Irish were out-earning other Americans.
And we had a largely agrarian country that was beginning to be an industrial country. So if you came here and you spoke the language and had at least some skills and a good work ethic, you could do fine. But we're having people immigrate into a country that's highly technological with a rapidly diminishing number of manual skill jobs, right? Yes,
and there ought to be even fewer once these lazy, selfish farmers discover that we're not still living in 1600, and they do not need human labor walking around, with baskets on their head to pick the crops. There are machines that can do all that. Time farmers come into the 19th century, actually. Also interesting is something I didn't mention in the column, because the Irish and the British, I believe, and I think certain Scandinavians are unusual in this. Another huge difference with today's immigrants and earlier waves of immigrants is about 50% of them used to go home because they couldn't make it in this country. We didn't, submerge immigrants in the warm bath of welfare here, we'll find a house for you. No, if you couldn't make it, you went home. About 50% of Italians went home. Overall, it was about 50%. I think it was only about 7 to 10% for the British Isles, for British and the Irish. But overwhelmingly, it was sink or swim. You can have an open immigration policy when it is sink or swim. Wow, that's not our policy. Now you can't even criticize immigrants for their bad behavior, as Trump found out with calling MS-13 laws. MS-13.
Animals.
Oh my gosh, they're doing all the drunk driving and the raping out in the Hamptons, and he calls them animals. The media calls him a racist.
No, and it's crazy, and they immediately conflated that any comment about any immigrant, even if the immigrant is in an identified criminal gang, MS-13, and you say they're animals because they engage in criminal activities like rape and murder, and as you say, drunk driving, that you are automatically criticizing every immigrant. So every Chinese kid who came over and got a PhD here is also, an animal. No, that's not what the president said at all. And
well, also, it reminds me of something else I mentioned in the column, this civic religion that we all have to act as if anyone who's not an American is better than an actual American. Just any foreigners. No, they're saints, they're fabulous, they're unbelievable. Wow, could you start treating, how about the flyover country, you people, that way? No, you hate most Americans. They just want to replace regular Americans with cheap servants.
Adios America is likely my favorite of her books, although In Trump We Trust is actually hilarious to read and very educational. And I always enjoy the columns, but this one in particular. And thank you so much for the time tonight.
Thank you. Good to talk to you, Lars. Bye-bye.
Nice to talk to you as well. That's Ann Coulter.